So, hello everyone, good morning. Thank you all for being here with us, especially my undergraduate students, Anna's students. And so this is a special event of Projeto Nacional de Letramentos, National Project of Literacies, in which we are welcoming Dr. Gabriela Veronelli. And so let me just tell you how this is going to work. We are also adapting to technology because we have our students here with us and we have you guys on online. So Lynn, okay, so this is Lynn Mario Menezes Souza and Ana Paula Duboc. They will be moderating the talk. They will introduce Gabriela Veronelli, and then she will do her talk. And after her talk, we will have some time for discussion. So people here, of course, Julie and Giovanna, etc., you can ask questions. And also, if you are online from all over Brazil and the United States, right? Camila Fonseca is Missouri and Latin America. Yes. So you can ask questions and make comments in the YouTube chat, and we will definitely select and ask the questions to Gabriela. So thanks, Lynn Mario and Ana Paula, for organizing this. Thanks, Projeto Nacional de Letramentos. And now over to you, Lynn and Ana Paula.
Thank you, Danielle. Looking here, speaking here. I wish technology would adapt to us and not the other way around. Okay, so it's welcome to this event this morning. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Gabriela Veronelli with us. And I don't like doing formal introductions, but I'd like to introduce Dr. Veronelli as a I said I don't like to do formal introductions, and she's Dr. Okay, I'd like to introduce Gabriela as someone who, first I got to know her work online, and I was very impressed with that when I was began to work with decoloniality, and there's very little work done on decoloniality and communication of decoloniality and language. And Gabriela's work available online was a breakthrough for this, and I think it influenced almost a generation of us working with decoloniality. So it's a great privilege to have Gabriela here at FEUSP talking to us. And Gabriela was a professor at Binghamton University. Then she did a visiting professorship or visiting researcher at Duke University. She is at Binghamton. She was a long-time colleague, student, learner of the great, unfortunately now deceased, Maria Lugones. And part of Gabriela's work still is organizing the archives of Maria Lugones, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. And for the last 2 years especially, Gabriela has been working with me and other Brazilian colleagues and South African colleagues in what we call a think tank project, thinking multilingualism and vulnerabilities, and looking at decoloniality from different contexts, from Brazil, from the context of the global north, and how this relates to the context of even South Africa. So Gabriela has played an important role in helping us advance our thinking. And so here today, you're going to have an opportunity to hear Gabriela em pessoa, whatever that means now that we are using our technology. Thank you for being here with us, Gabriela. Anna, you want to add something?
No, you said lots of things. Thank you, Gabriela.
I think, yeah,
Está
she's very
suficiente.
close to the computer. I'll be checking, I guess. Yeah.
There's a microphone there, so you don't really need it, but just to boost.
Good. So, thank you very much, Lynn Mario. I want to thank Lynn Mario. I want to thank Ana Paula Duboc and Daniel Ferraz and the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras for having me here today. It is my first time visiting the University of São Paulo, and I'm very glad to be here to meet you all and share with you my research and ideas on language and decoloniality. In the modern colonial world, we are disciplined to be lonely. This is the words of my friend and colleague, Jessica Chan. The oppressor calls this loneliness individuality. They try to make us believe that the body of an ideal individual is impermeable and intact. Therefore, we imagine the impermeable and intact spaces to safely contain our bodies, and we reify such spaces by cutting through places with racial, gender, and national borders. We are made believe that we cannot share spaces with others. We are trained to be untrusting of others. Places are torn apart into segregated fragments. So are our collective body and our collective self. We are lonely, indeed, because reaching across others' pain, others' deaths, others' desires and love becomes difficult. But we resist, we experiment. Many people around the world are with us. We know that border spaces and individualized bodies are violent designs. We undo borders and create shared spaces. We not only acknowledge, but also actively embrace our body's vulnerability and permeability. In the midst of a pandemic, shared spaces and permeable bodies, instead of increasing our fear, as the oppressor tells us, have become our survival kit. That's unquote from Jessica Chan. I want us to think of this resistance to having a vulnerable body and a permeable body in terms of communality and complex unity, and more generally in terms of decoloniality as a mode of producing a new meaning of social existence. Decoloniality as producing, as creating a new meaning of social existence. And I want us to think about the role of language in furthering decoloniality in the society at large and in our classrooms and educational spaces in particular. Resistance tends to develop as a mode of production of a new meaning of social existence, of a new meaning of life itself, precisely because the vast population involved perceives with increasing intensity that what is at stake now is not only their poverty, but nothing less than their own existence. Such a discovery necessarily implies that human life on Earth cannot be defended without defending at the same time, in the same movement, the conditions of life itself on Earth. Decoloniality as a new horizon of historical meaning for social existence and the defense of the conditions of our own life and of others in this planet is already raised in the struggles and alternative daily social practices of populations that decide to plot the meaning of life as radically alternative to the global coloniality and Eurocentrism. So this is already happening. To develop and consolidate decoloniality as the production of a new meaning of social existence would imply first, social practices configured by the social equality of heterogeneous and diverse individuals. And please, let's hold to this heterogeneity and diversity of individuals against the unequalizing racial, sexual, social classification and identification of the population that we have inherited from modernity coloniality. And second meaning decoloniality as developing new modes of producing meaning about what it means to live together. It has a tendency of communal association, of complex unity as alternative to social existence. So walk away from individuality. If there's something that the debate about and the struggle for decoloniality has made clear, is that the extreme heterogeneity of the colonized population resistance. It has made clear the extreme heterogeneity of colonized population resistance. Heterogeneous first in its history prior to Anglo-European colonization. History prior, first heterogeneity. Second, in what it has been produced by being under coloniality. Yes, first, what was there before coloniality. Second, the experience of living under coloniality. And finally, what is being produced in terms of movement and society towards an interruption of the coloniality, right? Like, so heterogeneity at those three levels. So it will make no sense to expect that this historical heterogeneous population, which makes up for the overwhelming majority of the world's population, has produced or sheltered an homogeneous universal historical imaginary as alternative to global coloniality. So this heterogeneity of populations being oppressed, resisting, is what makes problematizing how we interact with each other and how we engage with each other in conversations about resistance urgent and central to complex unity and social existence against the grain of coloniality. So that's the problem. What is the role of language and dialogue in doing all this? The question of the role of language in complex unity and reconstituting communality cannot be detached from the uses to which both language and knowledge have been put to in a politics of global coloniality. An epistemic monoculture that is ingrained in all relations and systems of oppression, and where language has had a central role as a way of realizing and rationalizing these oppressions as just and benevolent. Importantly, colonial languages were cultivated as repository of indigenous knowledge through tools of translation. Colonizing translation rewrote indigenous knowledges in idioms that made available to colonizers frames for making sense of and interacting with and managing words of difference. Colonizing translation rendered invisible everything that did not fit the parameters of modernity, thereby laying the basis for the universality of Eurocentric knowledge and the normativity of voice. Historically, colonial ideologies and practices of language played an important role in building the colonized self. Colonial languages were the foremost tools in the interpellation of a colonized other. Colonial languages determined the legitimate forms of interaction and engagement among colonizers and colonized that had been continued to the present. With my research on the coloniality of language, I have joined the discussion on linguistic colonization while focusing on the transformation and reduction of colonized populations to non-human status and the concomitant dismissal of their languages, knowledges, and ways of living as simple expressions of their nature as inferior beings. The coloniality of language, as you know, is derivative of and complementary to the framework introduced by world system sociologist, dear friend Aníbal Quijano, to explain the operation of a matrix of power that structures and sustains the connection among global capitalism, Western colonization, and the creation of a racial division of the human that produces a source of cheap labor, resources, and products. In my work, I have looked at how this racial split, human, non-human, is at work in language, operating through institutions, laws, practices, and desires that prescribe linguistic, communicative, and mental hierarchies. What interests me is the life of language, the language in people's mouth. Because of this, I have concentrated on the process of racialization of the colonized as communicative agents and as communicative cognitive agents. Processes that, in Walter Mignolo's term, reflects the darker side of the process through which a normative speaker was established to organize and signify the normative construction of the colonial society. So I'm saying that the racialization of colonized and enslaved populations as communicative agents is the darker side of the creation of a normative speaker, right? So we have the two sides. As you know, the two sides are important to all the vocabulary and the way of imagining of the colonial scholars. You know, be Mignolo, be Dussel, be Aníbal, and so forth. So, the coloniality of language shows how the colonial linguistic paradigm informed European colonizers and their Criollo descendants' perception and description of the linguistic practices and knowledge validation processes of indigenous and enslaved people and their descendants as primitive, animal-like forms of simple communication, which were incapable of expressing ideas the European colonizers thought to be integral to being fully human, right? So that's the big thesis, the big thing I wanted to show, that the description, the perception that colonizers have of indigenous languages was done in terms of natural naturalize it, the way of perceiving them as incapable of expressing ideas that were human ideas. The outcome of my argument is that the move whereby the in fact Eurocentric standards that norm what counts as language, human language, and rational communication are presented as universal. Yes, the move of something that is Eurocentric, but then it's presented as universal, has naturalized racialized differences, making the process that produces this difference invisible. In the sense is that the coloniality of language is more than the colonization of language as a system of meaning and a process of dehumanizing at the level of communication that has erased like natural barriers to what we think is communication, is possible. The implication of this argument, and here is where we go to the point, right? The implication of this argument is that by making the colonized modalities of communication invisible to the colonizers, coloniality vacates the colonized speech of the possibility of being heard, and therefore forecloses the possibility of any dialogical relationship between colonizers and colonized. I have argued that as the coloniality of language blocks communication between the colonizer and the colonized. It denies colonized people and their descendants any communicative ability. Furthermore, as linguistic coloniality silences colonized people's intelligent communal capacities as communicative agents, it also bounds to dismiss their knowledges and complex relationality, their forms of living. So you see, it's all together, you know. This lack of communicative disposition produces a deafness that makes impossible entering the way of living and knowing of dominated population and leads them to internalize the belief that they are linguistically and culturally inferior. And I think that that's the problem that we have inherited, this deafness and the interiorization of oppression at the level of language and possibility of having a voice. So this problem leads to me to the conclusion that coloniality of language deeply affects the possibility of dialogue among those who struggle for social justice while different locating in coloniality, right? Like, so people that are in different locations of coloniality and history of globalization, the possibility of them dialoguing with each other. More specifically, I have concluded that dialogue itself has been colonized. The coloniality of language blocks dialogue because it isolates each group within a tight, impermeable fiction in such a way that their interests are not connected, they are against each other, and everything that happens is through their relationship with the colonizer, and the only possibility they have of communicating with one another is through the colonizer's terms and language. Yes, let's remember Miñolos like constantly saying we need to change the terms of the conversation, right? Like the terms of our conversation has been dominated by colonial languages. So that's my contribution. Thus, part of the work to be done to interrupt, to use Lynn Mario Menezes de Souza beautiful way of thinking about what we need to do with coloniality. We need to interrupt it, he says. They need to be done to interrupt global coloniality is to decolonize dialogue itself against the deafness created by linguistic coloniality. And as you know, Lynn Mario said, US Latinas and colonial feminists, in special Maria Lugones' work, had been key to my argument because they have been at the forefront of developing forms of communication that defy the legacy and effects of linguistic coloniality in hegemonic discourses. So today, how are we doing with time?
You have time?
Yes.
15 minutes?
So let me see, because so part of my argument in favor of the colonial theory of communication have explained how and why Habermas' theory of communicative action in the public space is not useful. Because being a public sphere communicator is a condition denied to colonized and enslaved populations and their descendants as communicative speakers, in the sense that we don't have larger structures of power or their institutions backing up the meaning making. So that has been my argument, the argument that you probably know because you have read my work. So today I read something very long, and I think I need to cut it down. That brings again Lugones, and it's in this case Lugones working with Josh Price, and the connection they draw between communication and cultural domination, and communication and cultural diversity. It's a quite long argument, and I don't think we have enough time to go through it. So let me see if I have a way to summary it, at least in my head, so we can have a conversation of why I'm bringing it. But I said, right, like this connection that Lugones and Price draw between communication and cultural domination, and communication and cultural diversity. And yes, I'm using the word diversity. And the people that know me are like, oh, the word diversity, she's using diversity. Yes, I know, diversity is a heavy word, but I think it's an important word too. I don't know how heavy it's here. In the United States, it's a very heavy word. It's very loaded with liberal meaning, right? Like multiculturalism. But I think it's an important word. So I think we should not discard it too quickly. Maybe we can invite another name. But for today, let's try to keep it, right? Like, because diversity is the name given to the presence of those who were not supposed to think in our universities and classrooms, either students, professors, or staff. This presence is the result of the ongoing hard struggles of organized groups and social movements against monoculturalism. So let us, for today, at least during this talk, not give diversity to liberalism, but away from liberalism, we should embrace the diversity as a task, not a given, right? The university is not diverse because there's more people of population negra, quilombolas, indigenous people. That doesn't make the university diverse automatically, right? So diversity is a task. Yes, diversity is a work to be done to further complex unity, to further communality, and to further decoloniality, and to further the production of a new meaning of living together for the society at large, but also and in our classrooms. And it's so what Lugones and Price give, and that was the big long thing I have here, that there's no time to go through it because I speak very slowly. And this is not a class, right? Like, this is a talk. It's they think about these cognitive practices. Yes, they think about communication, but they also think of cognitive practices. What guides people decision making, and they go there because Lugones and here Lugones at Price is not so much interested in looking at the structures, right, or looking at the discourse. She has always been interested in looking at people, regular people, right? So for her, monoculturalism, understood as this process of cultural erasure and domination, is not just a top-down phenomenon, right? But it's a daily affair carried out by ordinary people, ourselves included, different located in society, right? Like, and that's why I always appreciate her work, because she allows us to see people, and as we see people, see ourselves. So in looking closely at daily interactions, Lugones and Price pay attention to these cognitive practices that guides people in their cultural usage, right? And by cognitive practices, they mean the attitudes and expectations that constitute our attention as selective, and that underlines our perception, right? Like how we make that decision, what guides our perception, what guides our evaluations, what guides our choices. That they are calling cognitive practices. So certain cognitive practices enable a monocultural political stance. And Other cognitive practices enable diversity, stance, and a pluralistic society. So I have all this planned out, but now I have to. So for them, and maybe then we can start talking, and I go more into definitions, right? So for them, the cultural, the cognitive practices, remember, what guides our decisions, right? Like people may say the consciousness, so they use this word cognitive practices. Why? Because they think it's possible to change them. And so they don't want it to make it too unreachable, something like unconscious. Yeah, too biological or too psychological, right? Like, so they wanted to make it as something reachable that we can change. And as professors and educators, we can, guide our students to change. So the cognitive practices that guide particular members of a society in particular situations of actions and making decisions and communication to privilege the dominant culture, right? Like guides them to monoculturalism, are certainty, simplicity, and agreement. See? So certainty, simplicity, and agreement. Just a minute. This is too long. And I think certainty and simplicity we can understand, right? Like certainty is this idea that two views of the same matter cannot be allowed. Yes, that the position requires all multiplicity of contemporaneous realities to be dismissed, right? Like the certainty is the cognitive perception that guides us to take decisions thinking that there's only one possible truth. That's certainty, right? Like anything else is wrong. It's not just difference, it's wrong. The simplification, yes, simplicity requires a kind of a perception and interpretation that sifts, yes, that sifts through sifter. Yes, sifter. Yes, like a colander, like when you call, the pasta, yes, and the what to say, yeah. So a sifter, like a colander, through which simple either or truths and falsities can go through, right? Like, so we simplify things. In separate and in going through the colander, things that are stranger or irrelevant or significant from things that are central and significant is one of the operations which certainty is possible. So it's not so much a colander. It's like, imagine the early, when people look for gold, right? And they have this thing, and they go ta-ta-ta-ta, and what stays is the gold, right? That's the sifting. You sift and you throw away what is irrelevant, what is unfamiliar, what doesn't seem important, and you keep the gold, right? And that gold is what allows you to make the decision. And the example is that is gold is precious, right? Like, because
we have the expression in Portuguese, separar o joio do trigo.
Perfecto, yes. So here, separate the gold from the irrelevant ways of seeing the world, right? Like you think that again. And finally, agreement and this maybe I have like a little bit more time because yesterday we were talking with Anna in the car about this. What is this? The need for agreement. Hold on a second, I'm sorry. So certainty and simplicity are often discussed in connection with the goal of a common ground or good. In a public discussion in a democracy, many people have the expectations that good arguments will be clear, simple, and understandable. Simple and understandable. They expect to understand others at all levels. They think of people as fundamentally the same. This is the Habermas understanding of communicative action, right? If the argument or perspective advanced by others in public discussions are complicated or unfamiliar and thus difficult to understand, they are for that reason discounted. And here we can think that they may be complicated because you live in a different, you have a different way of life, so things are unfamiliar. But when we are thinking of language, complicated can be because you speak in a way that I don't understand very well, right? It could be just simple as the accent you use, right? So because I don't understand you very well, then it must not be, if I don't understand you very well, what you're saying must not be very important, right? Because otherwise, so it's that way of listening, right? Like that cognitive predisposition. So the assumption that all people are the same leads them away from the possibility that two different conceptual worlds are meeting, worlds that include different possibilities at different accounts of reality, one not reducible to the other. Rather, people in this Habermasian transparent public space interpret all conflicts, and here is the important word, at the level of the individual and as motivated by selfishness. They think that the discussion is kept from reaching a common solution by people's pursuit of conflicting self-interest. So a common ground, yes, an agreement or common good is seen always as possible and as desirable from public discussion, because otherwise there will be anarchy in the sense of arbitrary and violence and willful disregarding of the other. So nothing important is lost from eliminating conflicting interests, because what is central and important is assumed to be what people have in common, right? So here the cognitive practice of agreement is the kind of thing that presupposes that we should live, presupposes, right? Like there's no communication here. We should leave our difference aside to reach a common good. That's the presupposition. And in doing that, you can see how differences are erased, right? And they are not only erased, they are conceived to be dangerous, and conflict is understood to be something violent, right? So this understanding of the common good completely defines how we approach conflict as something that in the classroom we need to manage, right? That's the big word when it comes to conflict. We need to manage conflict. So how when our classrooms are diverse, these cognitive practices of certainty, simplicity, and getting rid of conflict and reaching agreement tend to turn to flatten differences, so we don't reach diversity, right? It is diverse because there are people coming from our different, but the conversation we are having has been flattened. So yes, okay, follow. And 3 more minutes and I'm done and we're done. So look at that. So let me see. So when we move to the cognitive ground towards living together and understanding each other and engaging in the necessary communication for organizing life in a society that is a decolonial way of organizing life, because it is attentive to multiple voices, multiple constructions of gender, multiple understanding of what is valuable, multiple conceptions of people, customs, and multiple understandings of how to relate to each other. towards, yes, the cognitive ground towards decolonial communication and decoloniality as producing a new meaning of social existence. So far, what Lugones and Price give us is not a very, it's a modest ground looking at the three cognitive attitudes that will predispose one to communication across cultures and across colonial difference. Yes, what I call the decolonial communication, and to decision making that arise from that communication instead of from cultural erasure, right? Like, so you can see, like, when we take the decisions based on monocultural, that's making decisions based on cultural erasure, right? So how we can make decisions based on cultural communication, on the colonial this heterogeneity I was talking at the beginning. And these attitudes or cognitive practices are in conflict and resist the attitudes of monoculturalism. And adopted, yes, like that's the precious things, right? Like adopting these attitudes in our classroom is already, an act of resistance to live in a monocultural mold and to teach in a cultural mold. So I can directly to the bibliography where they expand this, but against the three cognitive attitudes that we describe, right? Like certainty, simplicity, and seeking agreement, yes? Presupposing that we need to find a common goal. The cognitive attitudes that guide a way of relating to the others in a decolonial, way, a way against Eurocentrism, against decoloniality, and for heterogeneity or diversity are of uncertainty, yes, and uncertainty comes when Professor.
No, I'm
so
just popping up there.
Okay. I thought it was. Sorry. I look at your Alessandra Fernandez has a question.
The special effects.
So uncertainty.
Gabriela, can you?
Wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay. So uncertainty, complexity, and open-ended. So maybe when we talk, we can go back to this. But at least we have really understood now the coloniality of language and the coloniality of dialogue, right? Like, even though we have not been able to go so much in the resistant part, now we have a better understanding of how is that dialogue is colonized, right? It's not colonized only because our languages have been colonized, it's colonized because our cognitive practices, our attitudes, how we enter communication already predispose us towards Eurocentrism, right? So once we see that, so we can start questioning ourselves, right? Like, so it's a lot what Lugones and Price are giving us here to, see, okay, when I engage in a conversation, how do I deal with conflict? Yes. So let's stop there and look at questions and hear from the people that are here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriela.
Thank you. Can I, before I pass on to you? So, Gabriela, thank you so much. Just
You're near the mic?
Yeah, they can hear me.
Okay.
Yeah. Just to clarify, vou falar em both languages. Teve pelo menos umas 4 perguntas, porque o evento não é em português, né? Então, só para avisar, pessoal, vou falar em português e vou falar em inglês. A língua inglesa foi a língua escolhida por nós, os organizadores, e a língua que nós comunicamos. Eu, Lynn e Ana com Gabriela. Esse número 1. E número 2, em todos os canais do Jornal da USP, no YouTube e nos convites via DLM, nós mandamos lá Event in English, tá bom? Claro que a gente entende e também se solidariza com quem não fala inglês, não está entendendo. O projeto nacional, a gente já tem esse projeto também de colocar a legendagem em língua portuguesa para todos os que a gente faz no nosso evento. A gente já prometeu isso lá no evento, né, Ana Paula? E a gente vai keep working. Mas só para responder quem está perguntando, porque em português não fala inglês, tá bom? But the event was, yeah, but we announced previously that this would our language today. This afternoon will be Spanish, right? And
Sí.
Anna's event, but anyway.
Can I say something a little
Yes,
bit
of
about
course,
that?
of course.
I appreciate the comment because it's important always to, check, on each other. And if you hear my English, you will see that I do not speak as a colonizer. My English has an accent that has stopped me at the border every time. My English has an accent that does not have allowed me to find a stable position in the university in the United States. So I think it's important that as we think of colonial languages, we also think that English is of all of us, right? And English is not just the colonial language of Britain or the colonial language of US intervention. Hey, English is the language of Bob Marley. Hey, if you smoke weed, you know what I'm talking about, right? English is the language of Martin Luther King. English is the language of Angela Davis, of Maria Lugones, of Gloria Anzaldúa. English is my language. But it's like we need to really do not give English to power. But also, when we are thinking about English as a colonial language, as a system, we should do the same with our own colonial languages, right? Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, they are all also colonial languages. Of course, coming from different empires, right? Like nobody say that the empires are the same. But like Mignolo said, and I think to many of you that are probably here already, I use English. I am not used by English, right? And I speak in English, and here I'm sure I'm not the only. There are people that know much more about this, on the strategic use of languages and lingua franca. I have, lingua franca is a heavy term, but I wanted to say that, right? Like because I don't want you to think because I use English, you are going to understand everything I said as coming from the empire, right? I spent 20 years trying to think against the grain of colonization. So please give me a chance. And I'm trying English because I think it's a better way for us to try to understand each other across differences, right? So please give me that chance.
Thank you for answering that. There are many comments, teve muitos aqui, mas isso é bem comum, viu, Gabriela, nos nossos eventos. Qualquer na verdade, não precisa falar decolonialidade e educação linguística. Pode ser educação linguística e formação, mas se for em língua inglesa, parece que tem, né? Aí tem aqui essa fala, né, sendo transmitida em português, uma vez que linguagem e colonialidade, não é mesmo? Bom, temos Lynn e Ana aqui, especialistas também, para nos ajudar. Se quiserem comentar da língua, it's right now.
A Gabriela já falou tudo.
I agree. Bom, vamos lá então. Eu vou para some questions. E aqui também, we all welcome all questions in everyone. Aqui, let me see. We have so many questions. Let me just choose. Yeah, I hear this one, Gabriela. Professor Veronelli, would you say that the language of economy is also colonized? Little economies are also affected to speak well. Does economy run through language? How are they connected?
Economy. Let me think. I will need to ask you a little bit more, like, what are we understanding of economy? But if we are understanding economy as an aspect of life, right, like in the sense of exchange, right? I think that again, like what happens in education, you have, you know, the understanding of economy that happens in through a colonial understanding of language, and that happens in a decolonial communication, right? Like, it will be interesting to see. This summer in the United States, this past winter, I have met the powerful feminist movement in Mexico that is called Cambalache. The Cambalache, I'm happy to share you their site, and they're also raising money because they are being evicted. But Cambalache is all about alternative economies, right? And Cambalache, sí.
We have a similar word in Portuguese.
Sí, en español también es el word del tango, ¿no? Siglo XX Cambalache. Sí. No, entonces las mujeres de Cambalache, su lucha principal es por una economía alternativa, no monetaria, non-monetary, right? So there is all about trueque. ¿Cómo se dice trueque?
Trocas.
Sí, troca, en un sentido amplio, ¿no? De troca, de bring to the market what you have, and what you're good for and what you're talented for, and ask for. So, and you can imagine in that market, right? En México, las mujeres están en la zona de Chiapas, and there you can imagine, you know, in that market, the troca, no monetario, the presence of a multilingual presence, right? Allowing for a non-monetary economy. So I don't know if that answers so much to that question, but a little bit in that direction.
One quick one.
Yes. Não, vocês perguntaram qual que é a palavra escambo.
Scambo, yes. Scambo.
Scambo, eso es
Scambo
troca.
is the informal exchange.
Sí, with no money.
Like,
No,
yeah, like,
de
I give
esto.
you something, you give me something
Sí,
back.
sí, but more organized, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
not that, you know, like, eso es la que las mujeres en Cambalache, and I share you with you there, or just search for them, Cambalache, San Cristóbal de las Casas, Mexico, and give them money, because for paying rent, unfortunately, they are not doing a scampo.
I
See,
think
that's the
we
problem.
have, oh my goodness, maybe this one on diversity. Professor Veronelli, what would we need to take into consideration in order to decolonize the language, the concept of diversity?
Okay, so that was like, that's when I rushed at the end of the conversation, the talk, right? So what I brought today is these tools that Price and Lugones give us to think about communication that allows for diversity, that does not tend to cultural erasure, that does not tend to monoculturalism, right? So where the attitudes of certainty, simplicity, and reaching agreement are the attitudes that flat difference, yes? They not only flat, they think that difference is something dangerous. The attitudes for diversity are the opposed, right? The attitude of uncertainty, right? Like the humble, yes? The humbleness of knowing that there are different ways of looking at things, and that sometimes they may be conflicting with you, but that because of that, you cannot be sure, right? Because you cannot be sure, that already puts you in a humble position towards entering a conversation. Again, simplicity, complexity, right? Because So throw away the colander, right? Not try to reach just for the simple things. Dive into how complicated things are and know, and this is glissant, that there are things that you are not going to understand. But not understanding something should not be the reason to be afraid of it and to try to rule it out, right? It should not be the reason to say, stay away of something. Yes. Glissant talks about this in terms of opacity. Lugones and Bryce talk about it in terms of complexity. And finally, but again, they wrote an article on this, and I'm very happy. The article is in English, so but it will be an interesting article to be translated into Portuguese and Spanish and indigenous languages. And the final one is against reaching an agreement as a presupposition, open-endedness, right? So conflict is not something that we think is bad for us, right? And they are this idea again of like conflict in the classroom is something that as educators we need to manage, tends to see conflict as a problem, right? So what if we don't think of conflict as a problem? Yes. What if we don't think of conflict as something that needs to be cancelled? Let me go just a second. It might be claimed, now I'm reading from it. See, it might be claimed that to live without agreement is to live in conflict. Without a foundation of agreement, one cannot forge a social pact that avoids chaos and anarchy. That's the presupposition, right? That if we don't have agreement, we are in chaos. But this is only true if one thinks that living with difference is impossible, right? So if we don't think that living in cultural differences is impossible, conflict, differences is not something that seems dangerous, right? But enriching, yes. So those I think that are an important tools that Lugones and Price give us to think of diversity in our classrooms, to make it happening. I don't think it's it's to think of decoloniality as something that we do, right? It's not a discourse, it's an action, right? That we do. How we do it? Today, I brought these 3 attitudes, and I hope, even though I rush.
Gabriela, one of the things, I think this is always.
Sí, ahí está, se lo ve. El micrófono.
No, we can hear you.
Yeah.
More.
You can hear me?
It's
Okay, so I think one of the things, this is always the risk if what do we do when we encounter disagreement or non-understanding? And I think coming back to the beginning of your talk, you talked about homogeneity and heterogeneity, and we see this very, very much in the work of Bakhtin. One of the things that's often forgotten in Bakhtin's work, because we read Bakhtin from our present, which is always gives value to normativity and monologism and homogeneity. But if we read Bakhtin carefully, we'll see that heterogeneity is the natural state of language. So heterogeneity comes before homogeneity. So we have different forms of language before normativity imposes itself. So that idea that what happens if we put an end to normativity and homogeneity, then
And there will be chaos, right?
there will be chaos. But there's always chaos is a natural form of being.
Yeah.
But chaos, understood as a negative term, is to see heterogeneity as negative.
Yes,
So-
absolutely.
Yeah.
And with Bakhtin, but also with Glissant, right? Like it's a myth, right? The universality is a myth, right? Like because even there's a universal truth, yes, and the universal discourse. That discourse has been populated by people, yes.
used to silence the heterogeneity.
Yeah, I think we have many authors to talk about this. What I think is nice about what Price and Lugones gave us is that, like what Nelson Maldonado does, right? Like they think about attitudes. And attitude is something that is very, not easy, right? But more familiar to put on when you are thinking decolonial. Like it's not a big theory, it's not a discourse, it's the attitude, right? Like it's part of your personality, right? So that's why I think it was something nice and fresh, to discuss.
Anna Paula has a question.
Anna Paula.
Should I use the microphone?
I think you can speak up, and that's fine.
I can. Gabriela, well, actually, I don't have a question, but I would like to share so many lessons that I learned from you in this morning talk. And this pretty much echoes what Lynn has stated with regards to the importance of your work to us, Brazilian scholars and teacher educators dealing with languages. So the intertwined relations that you bring between language and decoloniality are very precious to us. So thank you for that. When you bring this importance of conflict-free conversations and engaging in conversation in different terms, and in which we pay a criticism against certainty, simplicity, and agreement, that leads me to so many authors and so many intertextualities.
Yes.
And Lynn and I, yes. And Lynn and I have brought this notion of the dangers of being rushed to be decolonial and also to methodologize decoloniality. We don't want that. And so when we are here talking about decoloniality, we are still on the traps of a bigger system, which is capitalist, neoliberal, of a predatory type. So the example that you bring to us in which there's this exchange, this Istanbul, right? Which is a decolonial praxis, but still there's fundraising, you see. So, but this fundraising might be criticized, and we are probably in a moment in which we don't have ready-made answers, but we have decolonial gestures. We have decolonial attitudes. And so which language should we use when talking about decoloniality? There's no one-size-fits-all answer for that, yeah? And the value of the language per se is actually built right in this moment. And it pretty much depends and relies on who we are in the way that we relate to language, the way that our identity formations relate to language, for instance. So I was wondering, also, there are so many things that I could bring in this, but
And if I might add,
yeah,
I think it's very important for us to affirm and reaffirm that we're English scholars, that we teach the language, and then we are doing this work within, like Gabriela just said.
yeah,
It's very important for us, and this is what we do every day, right? And so, and you're doing something that it's kind of trying to shake the system a little bit with these perspectives embodied this perspective.
I think
It's important for the students to be here and to be listening to this as well, right?
I like a term that the Belgian philosopher, what's her name, Isabelle Stanger uses when she develops a theory of what she calls cosmopolitics. But without going into that, one of the things, the presupposition she says, critiquing Eurocentrism, is that we have to frighten our certainties, which goes together with.
Yes, exactly. We have to try to answer our certainties, and we have to put ourselves in parentheses. Like Miolo said, we have to place truth in parentheses, so we have to place language in parentheses.
Yeah, indeed.
In the sense that while we bring these important criticisms, there are gatekeepers operating, and there are restraints and there are limitations, but still those are decolonial gestures that really matter, and and place ourselves in a moment for open dialogue, transnational dialogues, transcultural dialogues.
So let me add a little bit to that. And remember the parenthesis thing is Maturana, right? And of course it has influenced my work and Walter's work, but he's the one that puts the truth in parentheses. He's a biologist, Maturana Varela from Chile. So a couple of things to say. It's not only English or Spanish and Portuguese that are colonial languages. The university is a colonial institution.
Exactly, that was my second.
You know, so you studied English, but you also study medicine, you study law, you study all these colonial bibliographies, but also ways of shaping the society we live in, right? So I'm not saying doesn't matter what you study, but we have to be humble and open-ended in our conversations and criticisms of each other as scholars. And I think that's what Anna is saying. And if I may add to these gestures that you are noticing, to keep the vertical and the horizontal at the same time is important, right? Like, so the criticism of why are you speaking English is a vertical criticism that I was explaining through a horizontal criticism, through a horizontal understanding of English, right? Like when I bring, there's no English, there's Englishes, some of them are colonial, some of them are anti-colonial. Right? Three little birds, right? Like that we can sing it together. People may say that's not English, that's patois, but that's a colonial way of thinking about languages, right? So it's tricky. But so you have the vertical and the horizontal, and keeping both of them inside is quite important. And that's the work of not that many scholars. Lugones is one, right? Like for Lugones, the interplay between the macro and the micro has been central because she criticizes institutions, but she doesn't criticize institutions from a macro position. She criticizes institutions as how people, particularly women, felt them in their bodies, right? So, and why it's important to keep the vertical and the horizontal at the same time, because sometimes if we just look at the horizontal, we lose oppression from sight, right? But if we just look at the vertical, we cannot see resistance, or we tend to see resistance just in the utopian, all Marxist understanding of revolution, right? Like the only resistance we will see is the counter, the counter hegemonic one, the big event, the hero, right? So let's remember to keep vertical and horizontal inside. It's difficult, but it's an important lens.
Yeah. Paulo Freire uses two terms in his work which are often forgotten. One of them, which I understand them as the vertical and the horizontal. He says we have to remember that there are two ways of being. There's estar no mundo. So here we are. We are in the world. This is the horizontal. We're speaking to each other. Who is my student? Who is your teacher? Right? Where are we speaking? In the classroom. This is the place. The horizontal now. And estar com o mundo. So at the same time as I'm your teacher, the mundo that I bring to this moment may be very different to the mundo that you bring to this moment. So we have the com o mundo y no mundo.
I like it. I'm gonna look into that. I didn't know that it also has some echoes about the standpoint, right, and the locals of enunciation that people like. Anybody? People in the back?
Yes.
No. Okay.
And that pretty much connects to the way that you started this conversation with us today. When you when you brought us these sharing spaces with others. This is so brilliant for us,
Yeah.
right? As well.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to repeat, how I started, and this with my friend and colleague Jessica Chang, understanding that this loneliness, that we have felt, particularly in the pandemic, right? Like when we were forced to care for ourselves and distance with each other. And now that feeling of needing the other, how much we suffer loneliness, right? In our bodies, people got sick, right? Like remember people getting really sick because of not having the possibility of reaching, not just for the loved ones, regular interactions, right? Like going into the subway and being like, don't touch me, like that touch of, that añoranza, right? Like it's a sufrimiento. I think it's, if something good we get out of this still being in the pandemic, if something we get is to distrust individuality a little bit, because at the end it makes us sick, right? But when we think the other, it cannot just be, of course it can be just our group of friends or our family, but what about, like Lugones says, to reach long, right? How you reach long. So there, how to be with others that are different with us, without being afraid of them, is, I think, an important task, especially for people who teach, and are in the university with people different from us. So I want to thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for
Yeah.
for listening to us.
And check out Cambalache.